Now we're going to proceed with our speakers. Ross Perlin is the author of Intern Nation, How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in the Brave New Economy. He has spoken on internships, youth economics, precarious labor, and related topics at venues such as the Googleplex, the British Parliament, the Economic Policy Institute, and universities including Cornell, Temple, Rutgers, and CUNY. He has been a television and radio guest on networks across the world, including MSNBC, CBS, Fox, the BBC, NPR, and many others. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian UK, and the Washington Post. He has addressed audiences of students, employers, career counselors, scholars, union members, Occupy Wall Street activists, journalists, and politicians. Ross is a graduate of Andover and Stanford. He earned graduate degrees from Cambridge and the University of London SOAS on a Marshall Scholarship. Would everyone please warmly welcome Ross Perlin.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for Pay Your Interns, which is one of the few films on this topic and does an elegant and compelling job of touching on, I think, virtually every issue that is connected to the question of unpaid internships. And part of what I want to talk about tonight, which I think the film introduces, is that it goes beyond just this question of pay for work, and the whole question has ramifications in the broader society, in the broader economy, political ramifications. It ties to major issues in terms of our economy, our education system, and I think "Pay Your Interns" is such a simple, perfect title because it's also a battle cry, and it's a battle cry for a movement which this film documents really well and really clearly here in Canada, especially in Ontario. A movement that has just grown up in the last 5 years and is still really in its early days. And some of the participants are here tonight, and many of them are shown in the film. And I think part of what I hope we can kind of discuss tonight and think about out loud is what the next 5 years is going to look like, and even 20 years from now, what sort of wider transformations in the nature of work are taking place. Because we're at a moment where I think people are beginning to question the whole concept of what is work and what will its future be, from questions about are the robots taking over all of our jobs, to the question of is work going to continue to be linked to pay, which is the fundamental kind of question that's raised here, and I think we need to sort of start looking forward. But first, a look back at where internships came from. I want to give a kind of an abridged history. I want to talk about the economics of internships, a little bit about the legality, although Andrew Langille will also will talk about that as well a little bit later. I just want to provide a kind of broader introduction to where this whole issue has come from, and maybe where it's going as well. So we're looking at an issue that affects millions of people across the world every year. Millions of young people, especially young people, but increasingly not only young people, work unpaid or underpaid each year in so-called internships. In the US, where I come from, there are at least between 1 and 2 million internships each year, approximately a third to half of them unpaid, many of them happening during the summer, the famous internship season, many of the participants students, but increasingly recent graduates, people making career transitions, people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s doing internships. And at the same time, high school students, younger people, feeling the pressure to sort of solve the experience paradox, as I've called it, that you need to have experience to get experience, that increasingly employers faced with the sort of the intense competition of the global labor market, feeling that they can demand more, and so you have to have increasing levels of experience, even to come in at a very entry level. Approximately 75% of American college students are doing at least one internship before they graduate, if not more. As was mentioned in the film, there are hundreds of thousands of internships happening here in Canada as well. But statistics are deeply lacking. Even the definition of what an intern is very much still lacking and open to question. This is an entire system that has kind of grown up very informally, as I'm going to demonstrate over really just the last sort of several decades. It's not like apprenticeships, which have been around for thousands of years. It's saving companies in the US annually something like $2 billion a year in wages that would otherwise have to be paid. Looking globally, as internships have gone global and now are in every country you might think of, that's billions and billions that are being sort of saved in labor costs. The word internship itself originated in the field of medicine. The first interns were young doctors. The term originated in the late 19th century, and it described this period of time, a transitional period between the end of medical school and sort of becoming a fully kind of credentialed professional doctor. There was this little period of time. It was paid at the time, but you were clearly at the sort of the bottom of the totem pole. But the term stayed in the world of medicine for 50, 60 years. So this is, even into the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, the term was very fundamentally associated with being a young doctor. I remember when I did an unpaid internship, I should confess, like most members of my generation. I told my grandparents that I was doing an internship, and they thought it was fantastic. They thought I was becoming a doctor. I told my parents that I was doing an internship, an unpaid internship, and they knew what it was. They knew that this went beyond medicine, but they were horrified that it was unpaid, because that development, the development of unpaid work on a large scale, was something that my parents entering the job market, that generation in the 1960s and 70s, did not see. There was not unpaid work going on a wide scale as there is today. And so it was partly from that conversation that I set out to try to find out what had happened, how over the course of about 40 years had we gone from a situation where it was broadly understood that work was work and you got paid for it, to a situation where unpaid work had become normalized, completely normalized. And you see that in the interviews that Cynthia did, that it's now been it's been internalized through various sources, and tracing the rise of that culture of unpaid work and the normalization of that, which I think is one of the most kind of insidious aspects of the internship boom, is really important, because that's something that not only employers but schools, parents, governments have all played a role in. So internships begin to spread into the corporate world, into, to some extent, government work in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But at the same time, they remain paid by and large, and they remain focused on training and recruitment. This was the goal for employers in the sort of the period where they were, they liked the idea that was coming out of the field of medicine, that you do need some kind of transitional period between the classroom and the world of work, and that there should be some kind of mediation between those two points. But what it really was about for companies, and at the time it was mostly big companies doing this, was attracting young talent and then trying to retain, if possible, 60, 70 or more % of the young people that they were bringing into the firm that way. That was the measure of success of those early internship programs, recruitment and sort of capturing that talent. What begins to happen really kind of in the 1970s, as I'm going to discuss, there was a whole kind of convergence of forces, economic forces, forces in the world of education. Unfortunately, a lot of this was coming out of the United States, where internships really kind of that term and this whole set of practices really took off. On the one hand, you have, from a very kind of idealistic perspective, many more students who want to get out into the world, starting at that point, this idea of the classroom without walls, situated learning, experiential education, doing things that are applied and sort of, getting out there and, already even when you're in college, not just sitting in the classroom. And so you had schools trying to kind of encourage and support that as a new form of learning, and the idea that students could almost be anthropologists in a certain workplace or in a certain industry, and be learning in that way. At the same time, you have a whole change that's going on in the world of work and in the world of business. You have the sort of, this growing kind of global competitive labor market, and you have the rise of a whole suite of forms of precarious labor, as Andrew mentions in the film, and internships sort of take their place as kind of one of several of these forms. You have temp labor taking off. You have freelance labor taking off, and these things, have only kind of increased year in, year out. Various forms of contract-based, independent forms of labor, where basically, for firms, what makes sense is to have as few people on the books as possible, in terms of the taxes they have to pay, in terms of the responsibility they have, and to shift as much responsibility as possible onto the individuals. And at a wider social level, this is also what's going on. It's very kind of neatly captured at a theoretical level by the rise of human capital theory, which was made popular by the economist Gary Becker starting in the 1960s, but has become kind of, even if we don't use the word, almost like the air that we breathe. And it's really the concept that you are the one who has to invest in yourself. You have to build up your own human capital, whatever that takes. Not only your human capital is composed of social capital, it's composed of cultural capital. Actually, financial capital gets a little bit lost in the equation, because there's such an emphasis on kind of building yourself up and investing in yourself. And the concept that employers or governments or societies would invest in young people sort of as a group begins to fall by the wayside. And the emphasis is on you, the individual, need to invest in yourself. And if that requires extended periods of unpaid work, so be it. So you have this period of what I've called the internship boom, where you go from these kind of training and recruitment focused internships, which still are only being done by a small minority of people, to then the kind of total mainstreaming of the internship, going global. The rise of things like an internship industry, including auctions of internships. This has actually happened, and it continues to go on. One internship at Vogue with Anna Wintour, going for $42,500. You're paying to work. It's not just a matter of not getting paid. It's this kind of star system, this winner-take-all economy, in which to get sort of close to power, in order to get close to superstars, it's even worth paying. And effectively, when you're working unpaid, you are paying, right? I mean, you're paying for your phone bill, you're paying your rent, you're paying for food, you're paying for clothing. These internships are concentrated in some of the most expensive cities to live in, Toronto, London, New York, places where actually doing a summer internship is going to cost you several $1,000s. It's not just a matter of not being paid. So this gets at the sort of, the core question of how internships are contributing to various forms of inequality. And that was, it was addressed to some extent in the film, but it cuts across so many levels. The rates of intergenerational inequality as a result of internships are particularly shocking. But internships contribute to inequalities of class and race and gender, because simply it's a pay-to-play system where it turns on connections and nepotism much more because of its informality than the sort of the regular world of work, which already is rife with these issues. And it's a world, obviously, without regulation, without enforcement. What we see here is a symptom of the decline of unions, of organized labor, of ministries of labor and departments of labor in countries across the world. I won't get too much into the legal issues, but essentially, these kinds of arrangements, unpaid internships at for-profit companies, are illegal in just about every country, because almost every country at this point, and for several decades, has had a minimum wage law. And that alone, dictates a wage floor that you should be paid for work. So there's that, that concept, that ethic, which Pay Your Interns, that call so clearly sort of states, is based on, there's both a legal framework, which the minimum wage laws are kind of the bedrock of, and then there are specific regulations about trainees that would cover interns, as Andrew will probably discuss. But then there's also a societal ethic, that you should get a fair wage for a hard day's work, and that's what the sort of the culture, the normalization of a culture of unpaid work has been eroding. So how did this internship boom happen? Who has played a role? Where has it taken us? What roads not taken have there been? Apprenticeships are associated with trades, with blue-collar trades, but internships have kind of taken over the world of white-collar work. They've become virtually the gateway into the white-collar world, something that's almost a requirement, if it's not literally a requirement in the cases of many schools and to some extent some industries. So it's often not a choice. And doing it once or twice is one thing, but we see the rise of serial interns as well. Interning 11 times. This is not unusual, getting caught in a kind of internship trap. Internships are not solving issues of youth unemployment. Youth unemployment has been at record levels across the Western world for the last 10 years. Internships are contributing to that. They're making entry-level jobs in endangered species because they're displacing workers. They're taking up actual jobs. The model of cooperative education, which maybe Stefan will talk about and touch on, has to some extent been kind of lost in the shuffle, and that is, potentially a way that you can sort of bridge this gap between school and work ethically and effectively and rationally, and not in a sort of a free-for-all. And there are other models that can work. So colleges and universities have played a role in this and bear some of the blame and need to be part of the solution. Many colleges promote internships. They give academic credit for them, even when there's not much of an educational component. Sometimes there is. Some schools require internships, but because they're seeking good relations with employers, because they're trying in difficult circumstances to do something for their students, for various reasons, because schools, unfortunately, are, we might have an idealistic picture of them, but actually, often have very bad labor practices, especially in the last few decades in the rise of precarious work. Schools have played a huge role. So in this sense, looking at the rise of adjunct professors, graduate students, there's been a kind of precaritization of the whole academic workforce, such that it's no surprise that schools have underwritten and supported and turned a blind eye to the rise of unpaid internships. And schools have taken on a huge importance. I've heard it said that the sort of the hospital university complexes of today are like the steel mills once were. These are the major employers in many towns and cities. If they're not providing in return for the work that they're getting, good jobs, solid jobs that can be the basis of a society, then there's something deeply wrong. Of course, there is a lot of variation by school, also by your major, your field of study. This is one of the kind of disturbing things that the internship boom has opened up. Different fields, of course, there's a lot of variation. Some fields are the worst offenders. And yet, across the white-collar world, it's it's amazing how far unpaid internships have spread. And yet, there is a very strong business case against unpaid internships, which Naguib from Career Edge really kind of articulates well in the film. But you're drawing from a much smaller talent pool. You're gonna see exhaustion and a lack of motivation in the people who are interning for you as they sort of realize. At first they might come in kind of idealistically. I've seen this pattern again and again, having interviewed hundreds of interns for my book Intern Nation. People come in thinking they're excited to enter the world of work, and they want to sort of get in and get experience however they can. But as they realize that it's not leading anywhere. And indeed, a couple of studies have shown very convincingly that unpaid internships are no better than having not interned at all in terms of actually landing you a job. I mentioned before how the sort of early days of internships, the goal of many companies, and a few companies are still like this, was to retain 60-70% of the interns or trainees as your sort of new full-time employees. That has disappeared in many areas, and literally companies that have interns for years will go without hiring a single one. Paid internships do have quite a different story, and the danger is that unpaid internships will kind of drive them off the road. But paid internships often do represent a real commitment on the part of the company, represent that they're investing in some sense. Money talks. Money means something in this case. The turnover, the lack of loyalty, the waste of resources in these kind of unpaid internship programs and scenarios where somebody's trying to plug a hole or basically grab some disposable labor. There's like a deep carelessness and just sort of taking advantage of the situation, which is so often going on. Not to mention now the ethical, legal, and public relations vulnerability that this has opened up. It's good on organizations like the Canadian Interns Association for having the walls of shame to actually bring out what employers are doing and make this a subject of conversation after so many years of normalization of people just sort of taking it for granted that these things have to be accepted. So I want to kind of close with what's happened in the last 5 years, which has been a sort of a small but growing and promising kind of intern rebellion. And I think internships have kind of come out in their larger context, which is part of the whole question of precarious labor, but also part of the whole suite of issues affecting young people, including rising tuition, including record levels of student debt, record levels of youth unemployment. Internships in some cases are the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I think we ignore this, or politicians ignore this at their peril. I think the energy that you see behind youth movements across the world, whether it was the Occupy movements, various movements against inequality, in the U.S. right now, the Bernie Sanders campaign, is an energy coming from young people who are facing the question of inequality and who are seeing realities of the world of work, and internships are very much part of that. There is a growing international network of organizations, of which the Canadian Interns Association is one. There are in the U.S., several countries in Europe, Australia, elsewhere, of young people, of former and current interns who are doing exactly what you see in the film, starting to organize, starting to raise these questions and actually begin a discussion, make them into try to get information, begin at the most basic level. When I first started researching internships about 8 years ago, there was nothing published on the topic. There were no statistics. There wasn't a clear definition of what this was. What you had was a sort of a massive legal violation and a massive social phenomenon just hiding in plain sight. And yet everybody had a story. I mean, you would talk to, if you stop people on the street, everybody either, themselves had been an intern, or their kid or their grandkid Literally everybody, certainly under 40, had some very direct experience and question if they were anywhere near the world of white-collar work with what internships were, and yet it was invisible. So just making this visible, putting it on film, recording the stories, having the discussions, having events, these are things which 5 years ago could not have happened and were not happening. So a lot of progress has been made, but there are serious challenges ahead as well, and the question of where things will go for the next 5 years or the next 20 years is still very much open. Some businesses are quietly changing their practices, some organizations, some government offices, I should say government offices also. I don't know the details in Canada, but in the US, Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill runs on thousands of interns. 20,000 interns descend on Washington, D.C. every summer and basically, power the government. As you're watching also the US presidential campaigns going on right now, know that those are powered by unpaid interns. Bernie is the only candidate, as it happens, who's actually paying his interns, but the tradition now is to kind of power whole sectors of society, whole industries with unseen intern labor. There is an expanding activism in the U.S. Legal strategies have been crucial. Dozens of lawsuits, over 30 lawsuits, were filed within 2 years. Following the first one that really kind of broke the ice was against the makers of the film Black Swan. So Fox Searchlight Pictures, a major studio which made hundreds of millions of dollars off the film, did a lot of that with unpaid interns. It's an ongoing legal battle. So there's a question of how far legal strategies can go, it'd be interesting to talk about how that's going in Canada versus the U.S. And there's the question of a backlash also, and of opposition to this, from unlikely corners in some cases. I understand that in Canada right now there's a battle over the question of when internships should be legal is something in the government that's being discussed, at least we're talking about it. At least it's becoming visible, and at least there's been huge progress over the last several years. But this is just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you very much.